Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Tom from CIS. I'd like to share some administration instructions to everybody. So as noted, you are actually muted. This is to ensure that the quality of webinar is up to optimum. So besides the speaker, no one will be allowed to speak. Towards the end of the program, there will be a Q&A sessions. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a raise hand bar icon. If you have questions, could you please raise your hands at the bottom of the screen? Click on raise hand and I'll unmute you and take your questions. Will that be fine? And of course, you'll be taking one question at a time. And because of the nature of the program, we only can take a couple of questions. So I do apologize ahead of time if we cannot take all questions. All right. So yes, thank you so much, Charlie. So this is where on this screen is where you saw the participant needs to be here, where you click, and from here you will be able to see the raise hand button. Okay, Kavita, I understand Kavita joining us. She may have a few words for us. Can we give her a few moments to come in?
I'm right here, Tom.
Hey, Kavita.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for. Hi, Lawrence. Thank you so much for tuning in to the first expert series webinar being organized by the Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore and Point Advisory. These are very challenging times, and we are trying to do our best to support our members in different ways. And we hope to keep you informed and engaged. In fact, last week we organized our first investor forum where we had 65 investors who tuned in to listen to our 6 startups, and it'll continue every Thursday for the next 3 weeks. So we are trying in different ways to engage all our stakeholders. So we are very thankful to Point Advisory for teaming up with us to do this webinar. They are a leading consultancy out of Australia, and they do a whole spectrum of environmental consultancy, but they have also been doing a lot of work in the renewable energy certificate area. As you all know, Australia is a compliance market, and they work closely in both the public as well as private sector, and I'm sure Charlie will tell you a bit more later. Charlie was supposed to be here in person doing a one-day workshop with us, and we were all very excited, and many of you had actually signed up for that workshop. Unfortunately, that was not to be. And we still hope that we'll have Charlie back in the next couple of months in Singapore. But in the meantime, we thought just to keep our engagement going, let's do this webinar. Again, very thankful to Charlie Nats as well as Point Advisory for doing this for us. And thank you very much, Charlie. And with that, thank you. And I will hand it over to you to carry on with the webinar.
Thanks very much, Kavita, and thank you for inviting us along. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to a new audience in Singapore about something that, as you say, we work fairly closely with here in Australia. So you've already done a bit of an intro to Point Advisory, so I won't dwell on that too much. Except to say that, as you mentioned, we're a full services sustainability company, so we work from the technical end of the spectrum, or climate change and energy type issues, through to the strategic end of the spectrum, so things like sustainability reporting and governance and human rights and those sorts of things. And that we have offices. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. That's where I'm speaking to you from today. We also have an office in Sydney. We have an office in Singapore and one in London as well. So, so we are servicing international locations also. All right. So this is what I'm planning on talking about today. So we've got a pretty short session today. It's a bit of a taster, really, half an hour. What I thought I would do is in about 20 minutes or so, try to cover some key topics. So looking at what is a renewable energy certificate. I suspect most people are reasonably familiar with that who are on the call today, so I won't go into that in too much detail, and also the notion of why we need RECs. I'll spend most of my time talking specifically about Australia's renewable energy target scheme. But then towards the end, I'll just step back a little bit and I'll look at key features that we see in different RECs from around the world, just interesting sort of features that we see coming out of those certificates that might be of interest to you in Singapore. So I'm looking to cover all of that in about 20 minutes, and then I want to save a solid 10 minutes at the end for questions. And I note that it's 1:10 already, so I'm going to swiftly get into it and try and leave as much time as I can for questions at the end. So in its simplest form, a REC, a renewable energy certificate, represents a megawatt hour of renewable energy. So it's a tradable energy commodity, and it represents proof that a megawatt hour of renewable energy has been generated from an eligible renewable source somewhere. And of course, in practice, RECs, they're not physical certificates. These are digital instruments, so they exist mainly in online registries and the like. Why do we need RECs? So think about the perspective of an electricity customer. So someone who's buying electricity, they're constantly consuming electrons from the grid, from this big amorphous grid, but they actually don't know where those electrons are coming from. They could be coming from a coal generator, they could be coming from a natural gas generator or a wind farm, they don't know. And so fundamentally, RECs look to address this problem by clearly representing a unit of renewable electricity that's been generated. And importantly, those units can then be traded and ultimately surrendered or used by the end user. And in this way, RECs enable energy users to make claims about the electricity that they consume. And there are two main reasons why an electricity user might want to make a claim about the electricity that they use. And broadly, that is, they may have a compliance requirement, as in the case of Australia. Energy retailers are required to purchase a certain percentage of renewable energy every year. Or more and more, we're seeing corporates use renewable energy certificates as a means of achieving carbon reduction targets or renewable energy commitments or those sorts of things. And so ultimately, by enabling the monetization of these certificates, RECs provide an additional revenue stream to renewable energy project developers, and ultimately they drive further investment in renewable energy projects. I should have mentioned at the beginning there, by the way, I can see the chat group on my screen, and Tom, I know, is monitoring it as well. And if people have got questions along the way, feel free to just drop them in there, and I'll try and look at it every now and then. And if I can pick up questions along the way, I'm happy to try to do that. So we see several schemes and standards and targets from around the world that use RECs, that involve RECs in some way. And Wikipedia tells me this morning that there are at least 67 countries around the world that have renewable energy targets. And most of those targets will be based in some way around renewable energy certificates. So in some countries, they develop their own standards for renewable energy certificates. So some examples there are Canada and the United States have the REC, just the straight REC, that they use. In Europe, they have guarantees of origin, which is part of the EECS scheme. In Australia, we have the renewable energy target scheme. So there's a number of national kind of systems for developing, for creating renewable energy certificates. But then for countries who aren't represented there are also international REC standards. And so the most commonly used one is it's called the International REC Standard, which creates IRECs. And so it's like a voluntary mechanism for tracking renewable energy internationally. And in fact, I understand that Singapore Power has just been accredited as the first issuer of IRECs in the Asia Pacific region. So, and there may even be some Singapore Power guys on the call today. So in which case, congratulations to you for achieving that accreditation. That's, I think, a big step for Singapore in enabling greater uptake of renewables. There's also a scheme called TIGERS, which stands for Tradable Instruments for Global Renewables, which I understand are also available in Singapore. And importantly, these voluntary registries that I've just talked about can be made to be compatible with regional compliance markets as well. So they're not purely a voluntary play. They can be used as the underpinning standard for some kind of a compliance market, if that is something that Singapore is considering, or any other countries represented on the webinar here today. But as I mentioned, I'm from Australia. I live in Melbourne, and the bulk of my knowledge is around Australia's renewable energy target. So that's where I'm going to focus today. So And in fact, the Australian Renewable Energy Target Scheme is not just one scheme, it's two schemes. We have a large-scale renewable energy target, or an LRET, and we also have a small-scale renewable energy scheme, or SRES. And both of these schemes are regulated in Australia by the Clean Energy Regulator. So for the small scheme, the SRES creates its own type of certificate, a small-scale technology certificate, or STC. And this is basically concerned, this part of the scheme is concerned with driving the uptake of residential and commercial rooftop solar, basically, is what it ends up being. There are other technologies that are eligible there, but in practice, from a kind of economics point of view, the thing that the vast majority of this scheme is taken up by rooftop solar PV. And one of the unique features about this smaller scheme is that it enables the certificates, the RECs, to be deemed up front. So whereas typically RECs are created either on a monthly basis or on an annual basis based on actual electricity generation, in the small scale scheme, RECs get deemed up front for the projected energy generation of that system through to the expiry of the renewable energy target. So in that way, they act as a bit of a subsidy, because they give you that upfront monetisation of the whole lifetime generation of the asset, which can then be used to break down as essentially a discount on schemes to break down that kind of capital cost barrier at the front end that can act as a barrier for a lot of renewable energy investment. So then we have the large scale scheme, and this creates large scale generation certificates, or LGCs. Technically, anything above 100 kilowatts is in the large scale category. So that does cover, there are some larger commercial and industrial systems that get captured there, but really the bulk of the activity in the LRET is at the utility scale end of the market. And there is a target underpinning the LRET. So, and that target is in its current form is 33,000 gigawatt hours of renewable energy has to be generated in Australia by 2020, so by this year. And I'll tell you in a little, I've got some slides shortly about how we're going against that target. Like the more traditional REC approaches, the large scale certificates get created annually. So you can't do that upfront deeming like you can with the small scale certificates. Both of these certificates get dealt with out of the same registry. So we have a REC registry that's administered by the Clean Energy Regulator, and both of those certificates get handled within that registry. And they both expire in 2030. So in its current form, the RET expires in 2030. I'm going to touch quickly on the small scale scheme, but I suspect that a lot of the interest on the call here today is probably in the larger scale scheme, just because of the nature of Singapore, and I'm not sure what the penetration of residential and small commercial solar is like over there, but I imagine that perhaps it's of more interest in Australia, where we have probably more roof space. But nevertheless, I think there's some interesting points to be made here. So basically, with the small scale system, what happens is a household will choose to install rooftop solar. They will then engage an installer to undertake that installation. And while they are contracting with that installer, they will assign the rights for the creation of those STCs, remember that's small scale technology certificates, the small certificates. They will assign the right to create those STCs to the installer. And in return, they will receive a discount, an upfront discount on the system, which can be quite significant. It can be a kind of 30 to 40% discount on a residential solar system because of the upfront certificate creation. So then what happens is the system gets installed by the installer, and the installer can then, once it's installed, go away and create the lifetime STCs for that. So that's modelled on the expected generation from the system out to the expiry of the renewable energy target in 2030. And then there are liable entities in Australia, which are basically electricity retailers, who are required to buy STCs every year to meet a compliance requirement. And that percentage of the amount of certificates they need to buy increases on an annual basis as the renewable energy target increases. So I know that I understand that you guys might be particularly interested in quality assurance aspects of certificates. And so I'm just going to quickly point out a few of the QA elements that come into play for the small scale scheme. So firstly, the Clean Energy Regulator maintains an approved equipment list. So this is basically solar modules and inverters and the like that are approved for use, that are known to be of a reasonable quality, that is safe, and installers must use that equipment for the installations. And then when the equipment actually gets installed, the installers, the Clean Energy Regulator has developed quite a neat smartphone app, and the installers have to scan the serial number of the specific piece of equipment that they're installing. I guess there are two main purposes there. The first is just to ensure that the equipment is on the approved list, but also that particular module or that particular inverter hasn't previously been used to generate certificates. So that's another QA element. The liable entities, when the STCs are created, or before they're created in the REC registry, the regulator will go through and undertake some desktop analytics to ensure that those certificate creations are valid before they make the certificates available for sale. And then when the liable entity purchases the certificate, as I mentioned, they have a compliance requirement, and they get audited each year to make sure that they have surrendered the right number of certificates on an annual basis. Finally, the regulator also conducts a random inspection program for the installations themselves, just to make sure that they've been done properly. So that's the small scale scheme. Onto the large scale scheme, it operates a little bit, well, quite differently actually. So the way this works is that a renewable power station will apply to become accredited under the LREP. And I say power station there, technically it's the nominated person for a power station. So that might be the power station, it might be the utility, it might be an agent of some sort who's accredited under the LREP to create certificates for that power station. The power station will then lodge a claim to create the certificates on an annual basis, and that claim will be based on the total power generation of that power station. And that claim occurs within the REC registry itself, and then the regulator will go through and look at that claim and approve those or register those LGCs in the REC registry. And then the power station or the nominated person has two options in terms of selling those certificates. They can either sell them to a liable entity, as we saw on the previous slide, which is typically an electricity retailer, or more and more commonly, we're seeing LGCs get sold to corporates who have renewable energy targets or commitments or carbon reduction commitments or those kinds of things. So there's kind of a dual market there, and that secondary market is actually becoming more and more prominent in Australia at the moment. So we see some more quality assurance elements coming here. Firstly, when it applies for accreditation, the power station has to demonstrate that it meets core eligibility criteria. So mainly this is around making sure that it comes from an eligible renewable energy source, but also crucially, they need to demonstrate that they have adequate metering in place at the power station, because that metering is what determines the total power generation, the total export, but also ultimately it's that number that gets used to determine the total LGC creation. So understanding that the metering is correct is a fundamental part of the QA. They then, when they go to register LGCs in the REC registry, the CER again validates those creations, and crucially here, they will compare the generation data from those power stations, from those REC power stations, against data from the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, because AEMO, they're the ones in Australia that control the grid, and they can see what's being exported and moved around from different power stations into the grid. And so they do a kind of cross-check validation of that network grid scale data against the renewable energy certificate claim. We then see again that liable entities undergo an audit to make sure they're surrendering the right number of certificates every year. And then finally, the regulator undertakes a risk-based audit program of REC-accredited power stations every year to make sure, just to go into more detail in terms of the claim that they're lodging for LGCs, to make sure that that all stacks up properly. So I thought you might be interested just to see what effect this has had in Australia in terms of driving renewable energy uptake. So the legislation for the renewable energy target was first passed in 2001, and the policy has gone through several iterations since then. There've been, and I guess that's kind of reflected maybe by the bumps in the road that you can see in the curve here. But basically what we've seen is a pretty steady increase in renewable energy penetration in Australia from effectively 0% in 2000 through to 20% in 2020. Remember that the target is the 33,000 gigawatt hour target that you can see at the top of the chart there. Oops. And also remember that the target is currently there's a 2020 target, and that's it. But the scheme doesn't expire until 2030. So the 33,000 gigawatt hour target will stay constant from 2020 to 2030. I thought you may also be interested just to see what the prices of LGCs have been like in Australia over that period. So this is actually a slightly shorter time frame. This is back to 2010. But you can see that historically LGCs have traded for between 30 and 40 Aussie dollars, which is, I think, roughly, it's kind of the low 30s, probably an average of about 32 Singaporean dollars. We then had a review of the scheme in 2014 where the government, there was a lot of speculation that the scheme would close. There was a lot of political sort of antipathy towards the scheme. But eventually what happened was that they reached bipartisan consensus on a reduced target, which is the new 33,000 gigawatt hour target. Previously it was 44,000 gigawatt hours, I think. They reduced the target to 33,000, but then you have this where you can see the steep increase in the curve there. Because of all that uncertainty around the review, there'd been a dearth of investment. And so there was a need there was a very high demand for LGCs. So the price went up to near the price cap of $90. And that, of course, did what it was supposed to do, which is to drive further investment in renewables to get us back on track to meet the target, to the point that we're now tracking back down towards that $30 to $40 mark, because it looks like, well, the target's essentially been met now. And what you see in future years, so the dotted line there, is that we're expecting prices to reduce over the next decade, and that's because, as I mentioned, the target stays constant. So essentially the demand for LGCs from the compliance market will stay constant between 2020 and 2030, but we expect there to be additional, well, there will certainly be additional renewable energy capacity brought into the system. So there will be an oversupply of renewable energy certificates, and that will push the price down. In this case, it's modelled out to $10 over the next decade or so. So this is my last slide. I just thought it'd be interesting to touch on a couple of what I see as being interesting features of renewable energy certificates, not just from Australia, but from around the world. Just things that, in designing a scheme, I would want to look at. So the first one is, as I've mentioned, in Australia, we have these, essentially it's two related but distinct schemes. So for small systems, so one scheme for kind of driving residential, small commercial uptake versus one scheme for driving the more kind of grid scale uptake. And I think that served Australia really well, that distinction between those two sort of types of systems with very different levels of technical complexity, very different customer types, very different impacts on electricity grids. Then we see in some cases that a single megawatt hour of electricity can actually generate multiple attributes. So in the UK, in the old UK scheme, there was 1 megawatt hour of electricity would generate a compliance certificate and also an environmental certificate that captured those two separate attributes of the energy, and they could be sold to separate parties. In Australia, we only have one certificate type that captures really all of those attributes, the environmental attributes, the compliance attributes, and so on. And that can only be sold to one party. So splitting out those attributes is, I think, an interesting idea. The UK also had a scheme where they would enable themselves to prefer different technologies based on government policy objectives. So for offshore wind, they would create 2 RECs per megawatt hour because that was something they were particularly trying to promote, whereas for onshore wind, it was only 0.9 of a REC per megawatt hour. I can see arguments for and against that one, but I think it's an interesting idea. I've got Singapore down as an example here. As I mentioned, Singapore Power has just been accredited as an issuer under the IREC standard, and my understanding is that the registry that's been set up is based on blockchain technology. And I don't profess to be an expert on blockchain at all, but my understanding is that it's really going to improve the traceability of RECs from the creation of the REC through to the kind of trading aspect of it through to the ultimate use or cancellation of the REC at the end of that. So I think that's really interesting, particularly if we start looking at wanting to match electricity consumption profiles against renewable energy generation profiles so that there's a kind of certificates are being bought in real time. I think blockchain is a really interesting idea there. Really quickly, some schemes introduce an expiry date for certificates. So I know that in India, they started out with a 1-year expiry date. You had to use the certificate within a year. And that, I believe that's since been extended to 3 years because the 1-year thing was just not quite workable. In Australia, we don't have expiry dates for our certificates. They just endure. But I think that's an interesting consideration just in terms of making sure that the scheme is driving ongoing investment in renewables, so that certificates aren't being dusted off from 10 years ago. Making sure that the new schemes that come online can get some sort of preferential treatment in terms of their certificate creation. And then finally, in India and Australia, and I think several other jurisdictions, we see a price cap on certificates. So liable entities and parties that have to purchase these things know that there is it protects them a little bit against price volatility and fluctuations and so on. And I think that again is something that, particularly in the Australian context, has served us quite well. So something else I'd encourage you guys to look at. So that's the end of my slide deck, but and I know that we're actually over 1:30 now, but I'm happy to stick around for a bit if people have questions to ask.
All right. So thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you for sharing. Like I mentioned before, for those who want to ask the questions, you can actually raise your hands and I'll unmute you, or you can post it under the group chats on the right side of the screens. So, Charlie, we actually have 2 questions. One from Jia Chen. He's asking that GHG protocol does not allow transfer of renewable energy certificates across different regions. Is this still the case?
I believe it is. I mean, certainly in Australia, I would be very skeptical about someone who had purchased so this is I guess the context would be, say, a large corporate who has a carbon reduction commitment and they're using renewable energy certificates to reduce or to kind of offset their scope 2 electricity emissions. And I would certainly be very skeptical of someone who had purchased a renewable energy certificate from somewhere other than Australia to do that. I'd need to check the protocol for the exact ruling on that. But as someone who does quite a few greenhouse gas audits, it's not something we see a lot of in Australia, just because I guess we're quite, we're sort of our own island down here. But I would be very skeptical of that, and I think it would be fair to say that yes, the GHG protocol would not allow that.
Right, thank you, Charlie. Actually, another question from Mr. Kenneth. It's asking who pays for the discount given the Australian resident solar customers when the RECs is given before consumption?
So what happens is the installers. So there's a bit of a lag between the household gets a discount, and then the installer has to actually install the system and then go away and create the certificates, and so there's a lag between when they actually get reimbursed, if you like, for that discount that's been given to the customer. Who pays for that discount? Well, ultimately it's the liable entities, which are the electricity retailers, who have to buy those small scale certificates. But then, of course, they're energy retailers, so they're going to pass those costs through to. Well, they do actually. There's actually an Australian energy bill. There's a line item for renewable energy target charges that get passed through to electricity customers. So ultimately, it's energy customers who pay for that discount. But in the kind of short term, it's the installer will cover the cost of that discount until they can create those certificates and sell them and then get reimbursed.
Right, thank you so much. There's another question from Mr. Matthias. So how does the scheme work in Singapore context? Are there any examples of which bodies in charge of accreditation, certification, or issuing of regs for Singapore markets?
Yeah, look, my understanding is, as I mentioned, Singapore Power has now been accredited as an issuer under the IREC standard. I think in that context, IREC is basically an international standard for creating renewable energy certificates to make sure that's being done robustly. And so the IREC is the body that creates the standards and accredits in that instance Singapore Power to create and manage those certificates. So yeah, I think that it's sort of maybe the answer to that question is a combination between the IREC, the International REC Standard, and Singapore Power.
Can I just add in a little bit here, Charlie? We have set up a working group which has all the stakeholders, and we are developing a Singapore standard on RECs. CEAS is co-convening the working group together with NEA, and all the stakeholders are part of that working group, including IREC and APX and EMA and EDB, BCA. I may be missing out some, but the idea being that we want to create confidence around the RECs that are created in Singapore. We also have private sector companies, our members like Sunseap, Energetics are also part of that working group. And hopefully our work was supposed to be done in about 12 months. We are still our meetings are still ongoing virtually. So we'll keep everybody posted once that's done. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kavita.
Thank you, Kavita. So Charlie, another question from Mr. John. Does energy produced for municipal solid waste qualify for RECs?
Yes, it does. Interestingly, in Australia, you can create RECs from landfill gas, basically. And you can also create carbon credits from that same generation of electricity. So one covering the electricity generation aspect of it and one covering the emissions reduction from avoided methane emissions from the landfill.
Right. Thank you so much. Okay, there are more questions coming in. Okay, there's one from Mr. Sanjay Kutan. So he's asking, what is the purpose of capping the renewable energy generation in Australia? Is it because of politics? Wouldn't a no cap allow better market-based pricing?
So to be clear, the cap it doesn't apply to generation. The cap applies to the price of the certificate. So the price is capped at, in the case of LGCs, it's about 92 Australian dollars. So it's about 80 Singaporean dollars per certificate. There's no cap on generation. People can generate as much as they like, but obviously once the renewable energy target is designed to get Australia to 20% renewables, and then it's actually very well designed because once we get to 20%, and the market, the technologies are much more evolved and cost effective, then it essentially phases out to 2030. And so, yeah, there is no cap on generation. There is quite a lot of politics in Australia about this at the moment. But there is no specific cap on generation, and I guess maybe the last part of your question there, wouldn't a cap allow better market-based pricing? Look, it would, but I guess markets are imperfect by nature, and I think having some safeguards around some of these things can be beneficial, particularly when they can be quite volatile markets, especially subject to political whims, as we saw on one of the charts that I showed there. So. There's general consensus in Australia that that's quite a good feature of the scheme, that price cap.
Okay, Charlie, we are taking two last questions. Okay, one more question from Mr. Rahan is asking if waste to energy is considered as renewable energy, then will waste to liquid be considered as renewable energy as well, especially when technology is without any emission?
Waste to liquid. So I'm not sure if I'm understanding that properly. I guess that might be conversion to biofuels. So from waste to biofuels. I guess it could also be pyrolysis or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what the specific technology is that's being talked about there. But if I take those two.
Sorry, Charlie. Tom, can you unmute Mr. Rellan so he can ask his question directly? Mr. Rellan, go ahead and ask your question. I think he can clarify to you, Charlie, what he is asking, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Charlie, the technology, it is synthetic diesel. It is not a pyrolysis. It is not pyrolysis, but it is called as a chemical catalytic conversion, which is there. And there have been many plants which are operating in Europe, elsewhere. And we are trying to bring this technology to Singapore. So my question was basically that whether this waste to synthetic diesel will also be considered as the renewable energy technology.
Look, I can't say. I guess that's a question for a Singaporean scheme when it gets designed. In the Australian scheme, I mean, biofuels are certainly allowed. They're eligible under the RET. I can't think of anything that would specifically exclude what you're talking about. But it would be a question for the design of the specific scheme. As to what particular technologies get allowed or not allowed, and often that's a little bit of a political discussion. But I think you're right. I mean, I think if waste to energy is included, then what you're talking about is not materially dissimilar from that. So I can't see why it wouldn't at least warrant consideration.
Charlie, I think one last question. Mr. Irvin is asking, how is energy storage or batteries in Australia impacting RECs?
I guess the main way that they're impacting RECs at the moment is, so they're not, energy storage doesn't really come into the scheme at all. There's no certificates for energy storage. But what energy storage is starting to do is to make renewable energy plants more commercially viable in certain situations, particularly in terms of the grid benefits that it can provide, and so it's in many cases it's underpinning the business case for further renewable investment, and then obviously when that business case is strengthened and further renewables come into the system, then they will be eligible to create certificates as well. So that will result in an increase in certificates. So I think that's probably the main relationship that's going on there.
All right, thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much for your time. I think it's all the time we have for today. If there's any more questions, everyone, could you kindly send the questions to CIS? You can send it to admin@cis.org.sg. We'll take a question from there, all right?
Just a quick one, Tom. I would like to thank Charlie, of course, for this hosting this webinar. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. Please stay tuned for our next one. Hopefully, we are going to do one next week on climate change and aviation carbon. And you will be meeting our next expert, Mr. William Pazos, who's been in that space for about 30 years. So please stay tuned and we'll be sending you an invite to that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay.